All right, good afternoon, everyone. In the interest of time, I'll go ahead and kick things off. My name is Kira Zeidelman. I'm with the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners, and I'd like to welcome everyone to today's webinar and pass things over today to our moderator, the Honorable Brent Bailey, Commissioner from the Mississippi Public Service Commission. Commissioner Bailey, over to you.
Thank you, Ms. Kira, and good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us today. For some folks, it may be during your lunch hour, so continue to enjoy your sandwich, whatever you brought, and then hopefully have stimulating conversation information from today's panelists. So I want to thank you for joining our NARUC subcommittee on clean coal and carbon management and the NARUC U.S. Department of Energy Coal Modernization and Carbon Management Partnership for today's discussion of Houston as a carbon capture hub. So through the NARUC DOE partnership, NARUC works closely with members of the subcommittee and staff subcommittee on clean coal and carbon management. The partnership facilitates opportunities for state public service commissioners and commission staff to learn about the uses of carbon capture for advanced technologies to improve the performance of the U.S. coal power fleet and other advanced technologies for the beneficial use of our domestic coal resources. So I'm pleased to welcome once again everyone's today's discussion on the future of carbon capture in the Houston region. Houston, as we all know, has referred to itself as the, the energy capital of the world based on its long history of oil and gas extraction and refining, power generation, pipeline infrastructure, and now, of course, moving into large-scale development of renewable energy. But as power generation evolves to cleaner resources and the energy industry faces pressure to decarbonize, and can the city maintain its position as an international energy leader? So today's webinar will feature 3 experts to discuss how Houston can take advantage of its existing infrastructure and workforce, natural resources, and emerging technologies to emerge as a carbon capture and net zero hub. As a utility commissioner, just a couple states to the east, I'm also interested in what's going on in Texas, what the policymakers are up to, and what their regulators are doing to take advantage and see what could be replicated or adapted around the Gulf Coast region. So today's webinar will be recorded, and the recording and slides will be posted to NARUC's website and emailed to attendees next week. Again, we want to thank the DOE Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management and the National Energy Technology Lab for their support of NARUC research and technical assistance on coal and carbon capture issues. As the conversation goes on, if you had questions, please enter those questions into the Q&A box, and we'll get to those, get as many as possible following the presentations. If you'd like to be unmuted to ask a question, please raise your hand, and the NARUC staff will attend to that matter. So I'm going to offer a quick read some abbreviated bios of today's speaker. The full bios will be available later and again sent around. So our first speaker up will be Ms. Mahek Agrawal, and she's a staff associate at the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University. She is an urban planner and former United Nations fellow and a Sardacious scholar and environmental fellow at Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs. Ms. Agrawal earned her second master's in public administration. She earned her first master's degree in urban planning from School of Planning and Architecture at Delhi. And she currently works at Columbia Center on Global Energy Policy and heads urban adaptability efforts with International Tunneling and Underground Space Association's Committee on Urban Spaces. And also she was a co-author on evaluating net zero industrial hubs in the United States, a case study of Houston, which I have a copy of right here, and I'm sure it'll be sent around as well. Following her, Mr. Charles McConnell. Prior to joining the Center for Carbon Management and Energy at the University of Houston, he was executive director of the Energy and Environment Initiative at Rice University. Mr. Charles also served as the Assistant Secretary of Energy in U.S. DOE from 2011 to 2013, is responsible for the Office of Fossil Energy Strategic Policy Leadership, Budgets, Project Management, and Research and Development of the department's coal, oil and gas, and advanced technologies programs, as well for the operations and management of the U.S. Strategic Petroleum Reserve, which we've heard a lot here over the last few weeks, heard a lot about, and also the National Energy Technologies Lab. And then we have Mr. Michael Nasi with Jackson Walter and Special Counsel to the Southern States Energy Board, where he practices with Jackson Walker, where he practices environmental energy law. I want to back up real quick. Mr. McConnell was also is also an author of a report, Carbon Capture, Utilization, and Storage, Linchpin for the Energy Transition. Investments and leadership can take Houston to greater net zero programs. So hopefully we'll share that around with everybody as well. Real quick, sorry about that, Mr. Michael. But getting back to Mr. Nasi's, he does compliance counseling, permitting, and enforcement defense work, spans the following federal and related program areas of the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, Solid Waste Disposal Act, Endangered Species Act, and the National Energy Policy Act. He is often asked to play a strategic planning role on behalf of his clients in the midst of large, complex project developments. Unfortunately, Mr. Michael, I don't have a report to show everybody that you've offered it, but I'm sure you've done some good work out there, and we'll be happy to share your knowledge, folks, as we get going on our presentations. So I'll let our speakers start off as we previously agreed, and I'll ask you to take it away, Ms. Mayek.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Bailey, for the kind words of introduction, and the organizing team at DOE as well as NARUC, in particular, Kiera and Jasmine. Thank you for pulling up the presentation. Also, a very good morning or good afternoon to everybody who's joining us in the audience today. So for today's webinar, that's focusing on CCUS hubs, or carbon capture, utilization, and storage hubs for Houston, Texas. I'll highlight key findings of the work that examines Houston as a potential net zero hub for profound CO2 reduction and removal. Next slide, please. The work was actually co-authored with Dr. Julio Friedman and Amar Bhardwaj at the Center on Global Energy Policy. But before I highlight the key findings of this piece of research, the role public utility commissions can play in this equation, a quick introduction to the concept of net zero industrial hubs, which essentially have concentrated set of facilities, plants, and associated infrastructure for near-term reduction and long-term removal of GHG emissions via emission control and CO2 removal technologies. These hubs have the potential to becoming key to investment and innovation of technology and business models in the next 2 to 3 decades of energy transition, particularly in locations like Houston, where industrial production and ports with large cargo are in close proximity. Next slide, please. These hubs have gained momentum in the past few years because of their multifaceted value, particularly their ability to address several economic and political concerns simultaneously. For instance, they provide opportunities to maintain as well as add new skilled jobs through infrastructure development and public-private partnerships. They can also help accelerate the energy transition as well as decarbonization, particularly for the hard-to-abate sectors like steel, cement, and chemicals that have relied on coal, oil, and natural gas. They can also integrate multiple technologies across various sectors of power, manufacturing, transportation, and shipping, which in turn helps reduce the cross-chain risks and costs. Also, because of the concentration close to each other, not just of the resources, but of the infrastructure as well, it is easier to achieve the economies of scale at these hubs and reduce the overall costs. And lastly, these hubs can also help us tap into the local skilled labor pool that exists in the region. Next slide, please. Essentially, these hubs combine infrastructure construction agenda with an emission reduction agenda, and they provide opportunities for development of 3 key parallel clean energy pathways that are commercially viable at scale at the present, including CCUS, zero carbon electricity, and low carbon hydrogen. Some hubs may also include elements of waste to energy conversion and biomass. For hubs that involve ports, again, like Houston, development opportunities exist for synthetic fuels, electrification, as well as trade-related investments like export of low-carbon ammonia. And on the right, we see that there are different production pathways for the manufacture hydrogen, which could be blue, which could be green, and it could be various other shades as well. Next slide, please. We talk a lot about CCUS, but if we look at the various pathways, there are three key pathways to capture the carbon and reduce CO2 that comes from burning of fossil fuels at point sources, such as power plants, which essentially account for nearly 1/3 of all anthropogenic CO2 emissions. The three basic steps that each type of CCS system uses are: one, carbon capture; second, transportation; and third being storage. The first step, which is the carbon capture, it's a step where the fuel and the air combines in a power plant to heat water in a boiler. The steam that is produced, it turns the turbines to create power, and the flue gas that leaves the boiler, it helps separate the CO2 from other components of the gas. Once the CO2 is separated, it is captured and compressed into a liquid form and then transported via pipelines to a site where underground injection into depleted oil and gas fields or coal seams or saline formations. And for smaller projects, this transportation could also occur through trucks, through trains, as well as ships. It completely depends upon the scale of the project, the geography of the region. And finally, this compressed CO2, it is heated further and pressured to a state that allows it to take much less space when injected into geological formations. So at present, the US Department of Energy is studying 5 different types of formations to see if they are safe, they are sustainable and affordable to permanently store the CO2 into underground formations. And these include the coal seams that cannot be mined, the oil and natural gas reservoirs, the basalt formations, saline formations, and organic rich shales. At present, we have 26 commercial scale CCS facilities operating worldwide with a capacity to inject 40 million tons of CO2 per year, which is less than 1% of the annual GHG emissions that were reported for US in 2020. But the good news is that another 100 new projects were announced in 2021, with a majority of them coming up in US. Next slide, please. The potential for net zero hubs in Texas is immense. It's, as Commissioner Bailey was pointing out, it has been for a long time the energy capital, but it's also home to some of the largest American manufacturing centers. It's home to diverse companies and logistics centers. Annually, it exports over 300 billion in goods and represents roughly 10% of the US manufacturing productivity. These and several other factors make the state as the largest emitter in the US, particularly for industrial and power emissions, which we can see in the pie chart on the right. In fact, more than half of the state's emissions come from electricity generation and power plants. And within the region, we see that Houston hosts the largest and highest concentration of emission sources, again, from power plants for hard-to-abate sectors that are situated within the region. Next slide, please. Moreover, the clustering of emission sources, the proximity of these emission sources to the geological storage sites, as we see on the map on the right, and the significant pore volume that is present in the region for storing captured carbon, plus the access to key infrastructure, whether it's CO2 pipelines, whether it's railways, whether it's international air and seaports, and the skilled human capital, the low taxes, it all makes the state a very attractive destination to not just develop, but expand the net zero hubs. Most importantly, Texas has a much wider legal authority to develop its natural resources for these hubs, as the state controls and owns the first 10 miles of shelf from the shoreline, which is comparatively much wider as compared to the other states in the United States. Next slide, please. Coming to the infrastructure costs that we estimated for Houston Net Zero Industrial Hub, well, we applied a set of assumptions to represent infrastructure components in line with Houston's present energy and material demands. The first assumption was that we will have 1 million ton per year hydrogen facility, or roughly 2,800 tons per day hydrogen facility, which would require 14 gigawatt of electrolyzers running at a 40% capacity factor. We assumed a price of $800 per kilowatt, which is much below the market prices today, but consistent with the near-term projections. Second, we assumed that to move the captured carbon, we would need 10 new dedicated CO2 pipelines, of which 8 would be onshore, each requiring $24.6 million investments, and 2 offshore, with each of these offshore pipelines requiring $28.4 million investments. And each of these pipelines would be carrying 2 million tons per year of captured carbon and would be 30 miles in length. The third assumption was related to electricity upgrades, where we assumed that there would be 50 terawatt hour per year for electricity upgrades, including transmission and new renewable energy generation, wherein the renewable comprised of an even split of solar, onshore wind, and offshore wind, with an average capital cost of $820 per kilowatt and an average 40% capacity factor. We also assumed a new terminal, a new ammonia terminal capable of exporting 1.3 MTPA of ammonia to reflect a key trade opportunity in the region. With this infrastructure mix and these assumptions, we calculated that Houston could reduce 25 million tons of emissions per year at a cost of $28 billion. That is roughly for every we could reduce 25 million tons of emissions per year at a cost of $28 billion. Well, these figures are not precise figures. They could be too generous, they could be too conservative, depending upon the project specifics. But these numbers are actually consistent with other estimates, including the recent estimates from ExxonMobil, which has a much more expansive version of a Houston regional hub, where the estimate is of 100 million tons per year of CCUS for $100 billion. Irrespective of what the extent of infrastructure cost would be, the majority of funds to actually finance the retrofits, the infrastructure, and new projects would have to be private. But at the same time, public incentives, specifically grants, are essential to attract that private capital as well. Next slide, please. Moving on to the existing policies that exist for Houston as well as in the US in general, we observed that for the net zero hubs in the US, a mix of federal policy support already exists, and it helps reduce the costs and the risks to investors as well as operators. But this policy support can be enhanced with state and local level policy support. For instance, the federal sustainability plan that was approved in December 2021, it aimed to leverage the United States scale and procurement power to drive clean, healthy, and resilient operations at federal level. And one of the 5 key goals of this plan is to have net zero emissions from all federal operations by 2050. For the power sector specifically, it has set the goal of 100% carbon-free electricity by 2030, including 50% of that electricity being operating on a 24/7 basis. The next federal policy which exists is the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, which was passed in November 2021, also known as the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. It also includes a set of provisions and supports the net zero hub development. For instance, this law commits that $25 billion would be committed for upgradation of airports and another $17 billion for port infrastructure and waterways. The other provision is $7.5 billion. Yes, duly noted, Kiara. $7.5 billion is committed for national network of EV chargers and another $65 billion for clean energy transmission and grid. The third and particularly important is the expanded tax credits that could play an important role, particularly the 45Q of federal tax code, which provides a performance-based tax credit for CCS projects. This credit was extended in 2018 via the Bipartisan Budget Act, but as per the Catch Act, which is not a law at the moment, but it proposes a further expansion of 45Q to $85 per ton of CO2 captured and stored in saline geological formations, and $60 per ton for CO2 that includes EOR as well, which is enhanced oil retrieval. The investment tax credit for offshore wind projects has also increased to 30% for solar, and it has been for wind, and for solar, it has been extended by 2 years. The other tax credit that exists is for producers of biodiesel and renewable diesel, which are eligible for $1 per gallon tax credit upon sale from IRS. Next slide, please. I'll run quickly through them. So in the context of the emerging policies, we have proposals for hydrogen production and investment tax credits, which could play an additional role in attracting private capital to produce low carbon fuels. We also have the ongoing new loan guarantees for hydrogen infrastructure. And we also have the Clean Futures Act, which was introduced in March 2021. It is yet to be passed, but if approved, it could provide financial support and regulations for net zero hubs in the US. Specifically, it sets a net national emission reduction target to achieve 100% clean economy by 2050. It commits $200 million in federal grants for state climate action plans. And it commits another $100 billion for the next decade to electrify the transportation systems. The second one, which is a bit contested with the Build Back Better bill being stalled, but it's new climate provisions, which will be discussed as part of the next reconciliation. If these new climate provisions are approved, it will help unlock another $550 billion for clean energy transition and $320 billion in tax credits for wind, solar, and nuclear plant, as well as billions of dollars in research and development of CCS and direct air capture facilities. Finally, we have local policies and initiatives that could provide support to developers and entrepreneurs, including the ExxonMobil's initiative to establish a Houston CCS innovation zone that could capture emissions from power generation, from petrochemicals and manufacturing in and around Houston. Next slide, please. If we look actually at the corpus of funds that are available, we see that there's a huge amount of funds that exist for development or deployment of CCS or components of CCS, net zero hubs, or select elements of it. For example, the SCALE Act or the Storing CO2 and Lowering Emissions Act, it allocates $2 billion per year for CO2 pipeline infrastructure. Another $8 billion is committed for hydrogen hubs and $3.5 billion for direct air capture facilities. The Loan Program Office is also supporting a large portfolio of $8 billion to advance clean fossil energy that could avoid, reduce, or sequester GHGs. And on a rural level, we have the USDA, which has committed $6 billion for rural electric program. Apart from these funds that are actually available at the present in the forthcoming years, in the forthcoming months, the Biden administration has recently committed another $44 billion for the financial year 2023. It's in the budget, so I can share more information on the details of that. But moving forward for now. Next slide, please. So apart from the obvious benefits and of these industrial hubs introducing emissions, sequestering carbon in Houston, these hubs will actually help realize the vision that Houston has set for itself in its first climate action plan, wherein it aims to reduce the emissions by 40% by the year 2030 and achieve a net zero goal by 2050. It will also help amplify the skilled employment and economic growth in the region. In fact, in a 2020 study led by the Rhodium Group, it was noted that the use of CCS with 45Q credits across the US would generate, across the US industrial sector, it would generate around 60,000 jobs, of which 40,000 would actually come up in Texas alone. Moreover, these hubs will help open up new opportunities and avenues for companies, for industries, for entrepreneurs who are working along circular economy principles and net zero opportunities. But at the end of the day, for effective and equitable realization of these benefits from net zero hubs, from CCS, we need an early engagement with key environmental, commercial, and civic stakeholders, which will be essential. Just next slide, please. And in this entire equation, the role that public utility commissions can play, well, they do have a significant role, not just from pre-approving project facility siting to streamlining permitting process, but actually including CCS as a power generation option for regulated utilities. In addition, the commissions can help reduce the risks to taxpayers by recovering costs from ratepayers and periodically adjusting these costs. Another option is to establish a clean electricity standard compliance, wherein a percentage of retail electricity sales would come from low and zero emission, zero carbon electricity. And similarly to similar to utilities that are managing wireless and gas, the commissions could help establish and regulate utilities that are dedicated towards CO2 supply. One option, which is the last option on the slide, which has been explored for select forms of renewable energy, is that of auction. If we apply that principle, that mechanism for CCS, for low carbon energy auction, we would be able to expand the procurement of low carbon energy and at the same time help lower the transaction costs as well. Last, please. And in conclusion, I would say that Houston and Texas are well positioned to host best-in-class net zero hubs. The current infrastructure and policy support does provide a basis to begin, but a lot more in private and public capital as well as policy support will be needed to actually develop a net zero hub at scale in Houston and across the states. These hubs' leadership should be independent of government and industry. And one opportunity that Houston or any other region could consider would be to develop a sister city network with other net zero hubs that can share information, that can share use cases, and at the same time stimulate political and economic activity. And on that note, I would like to conclude the presentation and would be happy to take on any questions if there are. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Mahek, and we'll hold the questions to the end. And again, if anybody has any questions for this speaker and the coming speakers, please put them in the chat box or wait to the end and raise your hand and we'll take them from there. All righty, so moving on to our next speakers. I think they're going to work in tandem with this is Mr. Mike Nassy and Mr. Charles McConnell. Let you gentlemen take it away. Thank you.
Great, Commissioner. Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. This is Mike Nassy. Commissioner, give me a thumbs up if you can hear me. All right. I'll kick it off here. Chuck McConnell and I will be tag teaming this presentation. We have worked together actually since the beginning of CCS development activities in Texas back in the early 2000s. The former secretary was the chair of the Clean Coal Technology Foundation, which became the Clean Carbon Technology Foundation. I had the honor of serving as general counsel. So we've got limited time here and we have a lot of material. Heads up to the person running the slideshow. We're going to be skipping a few things, but we'll get it done and make good use of y'all's time and hopefully leave some time for questions. Thank you for the participation. I can see from the attendance list, we have some great participation from commissioners and staff. So next slide. What we're going to try to do is Secretary McConnell is going to give us a brief update on innovating CCUS in the Gulf Coast, give you a lay of the land of some of the great work they're doing at the CCME at University of Houston and his perspectives on that. I'm going to come back in and talk about something that's near and dear, I think, to everybody in NARUC's heart, and that is how do you fit in CCUS consideration into the actual utility regulatory process and try to give everybody a few ideas. Where I'm involved in a project where we're doing a comprehensive study of that issue, so I'll give you some insights there. Shifting quickly, probably not spending too much time on just talking about the domestic importance of CCUS in the sense that we have a continued need for reliability and resilience in our market, and we have a continued loss of thermal capacity, and these coal plants are frankly a lost opportunity to commercialize if not all plants qualify, but some are very good candidates. And the secretary will jump back in and talk about kind of how that dead level sets the reality that we face, which is we've got to get busy deploying this technology if we think we're going to make a difference, and talking about the global picture. And then if we have time, we'll finish out with a couple of perhaps provocative geopolitical considerations. So next slide. And you can move on to the next, and I'll pass to Secretary McConnell.
Well, Mike, thanks. And I think in the interest of time, I'd really like to go from the theoretical conversations to the practical conversations of people that are involved in this, primarily the industries that are generating the CO2, that all themselves have a strong desire to improve their carbon footprint profile. In fact, many and most have made pledges to get to net zero by 2050. And so the whole marketplace shift has moved. Recognizing that the National Petroleum Council study came out 2 years ago, identified a number of challenges across the country, we built on that and also built on our relationship at the University of Houston with the Southern States Energy Board, as well as the Department of Energy, looking at the challenges and the necessary roadmap for broad commercial deployment. That's the real key here. It isn't about more demonstration projects, but actually creating this broad deployment. That National Petroleum Council study identified a number of key issues and challenges across the board. Our Center for Carbon Management has 20 different organizations in it. Those 20 companies are also members of a much broader coalition and consortia that I'll reference here. That's over 40 companies, actually now on our way to 50. It's all about the challenges associated with commercialization. And it's not technical. It's business, it's risk, and it's making investments that can pay. And if you look at the buckets of activity, it's really legal and regulatory challenges. It's legislative and policy challenges. And of course, the topic that we're all struggling with these days is energy equity and environmental justice. And those three areas are really what bound the challenges going forward, what our efforts are focused upon, as well as bringing along the technical capabilities. Next slide. So that you can see here, there's quite an array of folks that are involved in the oil and gas, petrochemical, manufacturing industry, but also pipeline organizations, research organizations. You can see that it's not just the southeast of the country, but in fact spans to places such as North Dakota, Wyoming, other universities in Texas, Illinois, Battelle, et cetera. So across the board, this consortia is a powerful group dedicated to broad commercial deployment in terms of getting the investments in place and having a construct in the market that will allow them to make investments that will represent their shareholders and themselves well. But make no mistake, there's a cost to this. And there's a cost that will have to end up being socialized, not only in the benefits to society and emissions, but the benefits to these companies, some of them quantitative, many of them qualitative. But nonetheless, each of the people that will be investing in this throughout the value chain will have to have their own set of criteria in terms of investment sensibility. Next slide. So as we looked at capture, transportation, and storage, you can see there's a number of challenges and opportunities in each of those areas. But you can get a sense from the map in the center, the broad distances that we're talking about. Here in the state of Texas represents carbon dioxide pipelines that are very vast. There's also more out in Wyoming, et cetera. But along that same stretch, there's hydrogen pipelines of some 1,000 miles, unprecedented in the world. Unprecedented in terms of its ability to create infrastructure for not only carbon dioxide, but hydrogen and all the other supporting infrastructure and necessary commercialization capabilities, pipeline right-of-ways, concepts in terms of legal and regulatory understanding of land management, mineral rights on and offshore, and the whole legislative and policy construct, not just at a federal level, but at state level as well. Next slide. So in our paper that you'll have a chance to reference, and I see Kara put it in the chat, you'll get a sense of the next 30 years and what's it all about. And so what we did was take a look at the places where those emissions are, the proximal infrastructure and where it exists, and how can we get the first mover tap in to each of these opportunities to get the best bang for our buck, short term with impact being the focus. And impact means emissions reductions. And so really the key here is to look at where the most sensible first mover investment can go and where existing infrastructure is. But if you go to the next slide, you'll see that that first horizon is then followed by a second phase where we're really expanding beyond just the Houston footprint into Louisiana, to the offshore, west into the Permian, and a whole pipeline network and development from the emission sources that are proximal largely to each other, and then the ability to extend this. And I might add that the geology in Texas is not suitable just for the industries in Texas, but in fact are being looked at broadly across the country as a place where CO2 can be moved into geology that's unprecedented globally. And so we're looking at this as a national opportunity, not simply a local opportunity for commercial development. And finally, the last slide really takes you to the point where all up and in terms of where the investments would go, where the pipelines would stretch to. What we did in our study was not to simply solve for a single solution with specific numbers, but to create a construct, a 20-year cash flow analysis tool to be able to put in certain assumptions, run scenarios, and create return criteria that people can invest into. That, of course, is overshadowed by risks, liabilities, individual investors' perspective of those, and they can run their own scenarios. So there isn't one single answer here, but ultimately what it says is, does this make sense? And the answer that we concluded was, if you can't do this in the Gulf Coast, you can't do it anywhere because of all the aspects that we've talked about previously here. Next slide. And so as an example, in that expansion area in the state of Mississippi, Commissioner, you'll find this, I'm sure, close to home here, the Carbon Safe project that's being looked at in Mississippi, the ability to create these repositories where we can ensure safe and permanent long-term storage under the kind of Class 6 permitting rules by the EPA through UIC, and the ability to demonstrate that this is safe, it won't leak, and it's something that's necessary based on necessary global expectations. We have a chance to lead the world, and this is a big part of the work that we're doing. Mike, let me throw it back to you because it's directly related to how we can ensure the long-term sustainability of our electricity grids.
You bet. Yeah, let's go to the next slide here. Thanks for that. Our goal here is we're not going to be able to do a deep dive in the time we have. We definitely have some slides here that we wanted to include so that you as members of the subcommittee and those attending can have access to more of this information. But you know, the elephant in the room right now is we have this drive toward doing something great on carbon capture and all the synergies that Chuck talked about. But we also have an electricity market that is really just ill prepared to deploy that technology. And especially when you consider all the different things that are happening dynamically in different market structures that are leading to the retirement of units, not necessarily the normal retirement. We really are talking about premature retirements here, not units that are already at their useful life that wouldn't be good candidates for CCS. We're talking about the risk of losing thermal dispatchable coal and ultimately gas that has decades of life left that could be a test bench for this technology. So let's skip 2 slides. I've got some material here, but I want to get right to it. The thing that Chuck and I always try to remind people is to not forget the last 30 years. The United States set an extraordinary gold standard for how to grow your economy and improve your environment. We did not accomplish the extraordinary air quality benefits that you see charted here in just Republican or Democratic administrations. That's what the color coding is. We didn't do it with ideology. We did it with technology, scrubber technologies, bag houses, selective catalytic reduction, mercury controls, all these things combined. It's important to remember that when we talk about how important the CCS technology is to deploy. It needs to have time to mature in deployment, and we've got to get that work done. So next slide. The really tough thing, and definitely right down the lane of this subcommittee, this is NARUC after all, Utility Commission Regulatory Oversight is a big deal. And yes, the vast majority of the Texas market is deregulated. ERCOT is grappling with significant market reforms after Winter Storm Uri, but certainly throughout the country and in some states, they've already recognized that we've got to have a much more meaningful consideration about all the low carbon options that we have in our portfolio before we okay, for those states that actually have approval processes, retirements. And so we, Chuck and I have used this slide a few times to try to just describe to everybody, these are the kinds of analyses that are not happening in regulatory commissions. And that's not a knock against you commissioners, because you have to live by the statutes you live under. It's really a call to action for policy reform. Wyoming has definitely done some work in this space. We don't have time to go into the details. I welcome follow-up questions about it. I'm doing a large project for the Wyoming Energy Agency right now about this topic. And the thing I would focus you in on this chart is the top right. A lot of misunderstanding about how CCS interacts with an electricity market. It's not just some big parasitic load. It's actually a load customer. If you think about it, it's not unlike a large industrial load. That's why some of the opportunities we see in Houston really have some synergies if you think about these capture devices as carbon machines, right? They are making carbon that can be deployed either into an oil field or sequestered, but their electricity usage is something that can be used as an asset, not just as a liability, right? If you think about that in the deployment of the projects, you can get more flexibility. Petronova, a lot of misunderstanding of the biggest carbon capture project in the world, was a wild success on the carbon capture side of the equation. The downstream side is what became a challenge there. We'll figure those things out. We have abundant sequestration capacity to do it. But some of the innovation that they thought about in that project, we can expand upon and think about these units more flexibly. Have these units drawing flue gas from multiple units so that you can play off of each other. I think a lot of the economic analyses that have been done, frankly, just was ignorant of a lot of the flexibility these units can have in a market scenario. And the other thing that's obviously captured in this slide is a whole lot of information about, listen, not all carbon reductions are created equal. Every energy resource has a footprint environmentally. Renewable is no exception. This is not a bash against renewable, but there are significant shortcomings to a renewable dominated grid that we have to own right alongside figuring out ways to bring down the cost of carbon capture. So let's go to the next slide. Really the best kind of gold standard work that's been done about evaluating what is possible relative to a retirement decision if you deploy CCS was done by the Department of Energy. They did a fantastic analysis of a plant in Colorado, one that didn't ultimately get approved to stay open. It actually was prematurely retired and was approved for that. That's actually been something that has been delayed because of the need for thermal dispatchable capacity desperately, especially in a high gas price environment. But we don't have time to go there, but please look this work up that the Department of Energy did about Colorado's decision-making there, because it shows some significant realizations about how you not only can have a job creation and an economic benefit, you can also actually reduce more carbon by deploying this technology. So let's go ahead to the next slide. We're not going to have the time to spend on this topic that we should, but let me remind everybody, and I know every commissioner takes their job and their responsibility seriously, but it's absolutely shocking that in 2020 and 2021, we would have an electricity market that was so close to catastrophic failure as what we saw in Winter Storm Uri. And there's been a lot of ink spilled trying to point fingers, but let's be really clear about what happened. Next slide. It's interesting that right before Uri, MISO actually put out a report flagging that, you get beyond a 33% penetration mark with renewable energy. Nothing against renewable energy. It just can't be the workhorse of your grid if you don't have other aspects built in. You start to have problems. They predicted that would happen. Next slide. Well, then Winter Storm Uri hit. And this slide has a lot on it, and we won't be able to cover it, but I think you get the takeaway. If you look at the installed capacity of energy types in each of the big markets reflected here, during Winter Storm Uri, the performance is the blue bar during the storm. The installed capacity is the gray bar. What you see is that we have a fuel resilient component of our grid and a weather dependent component of our grid. Doesn't make one inherently better than the other, but we certainly can't do without the fuel resilient component. And so as we are making decisions on utility planning, whether it's part of resource planning, part of prudence reviews, we are hopeful, and many are talking about it. Certainly a lot of work is being done in SPP and MISO and ERCOT about this, that we're going to need to take reliability and resilience a lot more seriously as we evaluate retirement decisions. And with carbon reduction pressures, there's an opportunity there. So here we're going to skip a few slides, just people who are running it, because we're running out of time. Let's go all the way to the animated slide on slide 23. It's really important that a lot of work has been done. This slide is a good place to stop. MIT did a fantastic study, and it tells a story that perhaps is not a surprise to anybody, but because of the limitations, both in scale and cost on battery technologies, we are not going to be able to have a deep penetration, a zero carbon type grid possibility in a cost effective way, unless we have massive deployment of carbon capture. And that utility regulatory review of retirements has something to do with it. We were going to go through this animated slide, but I do want to make sure we have time for questions. So we're not going to do that. Go ahead and skip the next slide. We have slides here that talk about, and you can just step through how we might be very bullish about battery capacity, but relative to our actual needs in the grid, we're never going to have battery technology deployed at a scale that allows us to run a 100% renewable grid. Next slide. This is the final kind of summing up when you get to a provocative statement. Keep going on the slide 24, please. Yeah. Yes, carbon dioxide is ubiquitous. Carbon dioxide reductions in one place shouldn't matter more than another. But Chuck and I are going to challenge that. Because you've got a 24/7 low carbon resource that doesn't actually adversely affect reliability and resilience, we've got to take a different and new look at the value of CCS deployed on existing thermal because of its role. So jump to the next slide, and this is a perfect transition, handing it back to Chuck, because we got to take the world into consideration. So in the next two slides, Chuck will take up a continuum of what it means to utilize domestic thermal plants before they retire as the test bed for what is internationally an essential deployment of technology. So go ahead to the next slide and I'll hand back to Chuck.
Yeah, Mike, thanks. And really the message here is keep your eye on the ball. And what's the ball? The ball is emissions-free electricity generation. It isn't a race to deploy renewables. It's a race to lower emissions. And if you think about it that way, it's very, very obvious in terms of the impact. If you look at the premature retirement of every coal and gas plant, we lose that vital opportunity to commercialize. It's essential to have it be part of our mix going forward, because as Mike said, you can think about batteries in terms of minutes or even a day or two. But in terms of long-term resilience and ultimately the long-term requirements for batteries and minerals and everything associated with that, storage from batteries is not going to be the answer for grid stability. But I think more importantly, if you take a step back from a global position, the International Energy Agency and the IPCC's latest report not only suggests but demands that CCUS has to be deployed. 15 to 20% of the overall impact globally in emissions reductions must come from CCUS. And in fact, they looked at a myriad of scenarios, came up with only 7 that were reasonable in terms of meeting climate targets. And of those 7, only 1 did not include CCUS. But what that 1 did include without CCUS was an expectation that global electricity requirements would be cut in half in the next 40 years. Now, I don't know about you, but I think that's about as ridiculous as you could look at any future scenario. And in terms of growing energy, Mike and I say it all the time. You cannot grow by subtraction. You have to have all of the features and capabilities at your disposal. And CCUS, we believe, is an essential part of keeping that baseload capability that we all rely on in place.
So let's finish with the next slide here. This is a great place to leave it at and move into Q&A with these commissioners, because the bottom line story we're telling here is played out in the actual data that IEA and the models that IPCC uses. We've been using and focusing on this chart for almost 10 years now, Chuck. This is just math. It's not a debate about climate change, okay? We aren't moving the needle by just shutting stuff down domestically. We'll only move the needle if we deploy technology and make it cost effective for global relevance. The domestic fleet zeroed out is the black mark. Our economy zeroed out is the red mark. The blue pie is the target. And that blue pie is an unaccomplishable goal for carbon mitigation unless the wealthiest and most technologically advanced nations, and the US better be a leader, right, don't throw away assets that they could be using to deploy that technology. Now, as commissioners, there's only so much a commissioner can do, but in conversations between and among states, with RTOs and with legislators who can affect policy about how retirement decisions are reviewed, we need to start taking this international picture better in mind, because we're just fooling ourselves by thinking we're making a difference by throwing up renewable energy and shutting down thermal dispatchable capacity. Chuck, I'll let you have the last word.
But you know, Mike, as we always say, it's not something where the US is just going to throw dollars to the developing world and hope they do the right things with it. What we can do is take American industries with American know-how and US capabilities, deploy it globally, and have that be an accretive part of our economy as well. This isn't a handout. This is an ability to take American ingenuity globally and realize value for us all.
Well, we'll move to Q&A, Kira.
Thank you, everybody. I appreciate your time and your expertise and your knowledge base, all 3 of the day's panelists, and joining in that conversation and really talking about the attributes and the opportunities and possibilities around carbon capture, utilization, sequestration, storage, however it is defined in whatever aspect of utility regulation, technology development, economic support, however you frame that. I'm not sure if any questions came up right offhand that I see in the chat box. Let's see if we got one right. So a question real quick, and because I want to give, for those that have stuck around with us, the opportunity to ask questions. So from your presentation, I learned they are planning to capture and store CO2. Have they considered recycling some of it by way of agriculture? So I'm not sure who that would be directed at, but I guess, are there best practices that agricultural and the forestry sector can utilize? I assume to work in tandem with the energy sector that produces a net I guess, a net reduction of atmospheric carbon. I'm not sure if that's what it means, but that's why I'm going to read into it.
Well, Commissioner Bailey, if I could, I mean, clearly nature-based solutions are a big part of our future. The ability to replenish forestation that's been removed, et cetera. But I think the other part of this is that we've got to get really clear on is that when you buy a tree and create carbon credits with that tree you planted, if in 50 years, all you do is cut that tree down and burn it in something, you haven't sequestered carbon, you've simply kicked the can. And so what we've looked at is the ability to integrate long-term, the ability to do bioengineered capabilities of combusting that wood or wood waste material, capturing the CO2 and utilizing CCUS as an ability to close the loop, not simply to feel good about buying a carbon credit, but to actually accomplish a real carbon sequestered.
And both Chuck and I serve on the EERC's foundation board. I have the honor of doing that. And that's kind of a model. All these states should be working together. So it's great that the Houston team is teamed up with the North Dakota team there, and a lot of crossover to Wyoming as well. And agricultural sequestration is definitely a big part. And there's some exciting work going on up at EERC on that topic. Mug, did you have anything you wanted to add?
I think just to add on to what has been said, NBS, I would say, are needed from more of an adaptation perspective rather than emission reduction, because as Chuck was saying that, using NBS is not a long-term, it's not a durable solution, because what we plant today, what we are putting out, sequestering right now, we don't have a guarantee that through land use, through land cover conversion, or through pest or any other risk, it will not be unlocked in the future. So yes, CCS is a more permanent solution to actually lock out permanently that carbon from the atmosphere, from the point sources.
I know we're closing in on an hour here, and I could probably sit here and have a lot of good thoughts because you did mention some things I was personally interested in, the the Petronova project and where that was at. Of course, being a Mississippi commissioner, we have a recent history with carbon capture projects and technology with the Kemper facility, now plant Ratcliffe, and the ramifications it had in the I guess the now how it's publicly viewed because of the extensive costs and what went on with that aspect of it. But just kind of as we wrapping up here, and again, I appreciate everybody's time. So we've seen recently, and just referring back to the maps that was shown, the amount of infrastructure and investment needed on pipelines, processing centers, underground injections, particularly certain transmission, as we grow these technologies and the level of investment needed in the level of structures potentially to, as we look at multi-state opportunities here, with the NEPA provisions, the National Energy Environmental Policy Act, and the recent announcement of more, I guess you say, aggressive and in-depth studies around the impacts of major projects. And given that, a lot of what's being discussed here is on the front end of what could potentially be major investments and expansion of infrastructure. How do you, when you look at pipelines, transmission, terminals, and all those types of things, do we see the re-expansion of the NEPA provisions as being a hindrance or a working in conjunction to help promote and expand these technologies?
Well, I'll jump in as the geeky environmental lawyer and just tell you that NEPA reform is one of the most important infrastructure development priorities you can have. And we saw, and I'm not going to get political here, we saw meaningful reform. And now we are talking about retraction and frankly, just a complete contradiction and policy priorities. So many good things moving forward about hubs and R&D and commercialization could basically not come to pass because we just can't get ourselves over doing NEPA the right way, as opposed to letting it be weaponized to stop projects of all kinds, because that NEPA weapon will be used just as often to stop a wind-driven transmission project as it will to stop a hydrogen pipeline or a sequestration project. We've got to return that statute's implementation back to its original purpose. We were on a good track. I'd love to see the administration pivot back to that track.
Yeah, and let's remember something, Commissioner. If we really do believe that our heart is in the place that emissions reduction is necessary for the good of the public, and that we want to do it as expeditiously and effectively as we possibly can, and we all agree that it's for the good of the public, how could we not do what Mike just suggested? And by the way, if you look at scenarios through the International Energy Agency, going forward, scenarios that are with carbon capture and storage vastly deployed compared to those that ignore carbon capture and storage, it is no less than 139% more expensive to do it without CCUS. And for the good of the public and for the ratepayers and everybody we're so concerned about, we need to be thinking about environmental and energy equity. And I believe that CCUS is the way that that can be delivered clearly the most effective way.
Well, I thank you, everybody. I thank you there. We're going to, now that we've expired our time, I appreciate everybody's well-informed, very comprehensive. I know there's a lot more information that could have been utilized. And I think we certainly have some deeper conversations around the application of this technology, not just in the Texas area, not just in Mississippi, Alabama, the Southeast, but throughout the U.S. and across the world. So I want to thank everybody. I want to thank Mahek, Mr. Michael, Mr. Charles. I want to thank you for your time today and for everybody joining on, especially the DOE Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management for supporting this webinar. So this is the end. Stay tuned for additional webinars in the future. We're also preparing for the NARUC Summer Policy Summit, July 17 through 20 in sunny San Diego. Hope we'll see some of you there. And of course, the Subcommittee on Clean Coal and Carbon Management will have a panel on Monday, July 18, unpacking the West Virginia versus EPA decision from the Supreme Court, which is expected to have some kind of announcement or resolution this spring. So continue to check the NARUC's website for more information on upcoming activities, webinars, etc. And reach out to Kira and Jasmine at NARUC anytime with any questions or feedback or suggestions for additional information, support, etc. And you'll see some of the other things there on the screen for your consumption. Again, thank you to the speakers. Thank you for everyone participating today. Feel free to reach out anytime, and thank y'all so much. Y'all have a great afternoon wherever you are.
Thank y'all.
Thank you.
Thank you.